Okay, so from the poll, you may have gathered that today we'll be talking about charging behavior. Okay, so thinking about the status quo, filling up a gas car, it's pretty different, right? So generally, right, what most people do is you drive until the tank is kind of empty, and then you go and refill your car at the gas station. Easy enough. This task is, I think, very sort of minimally intrusive because it's so fast, right? And so that's where a lot of the concerns about charging start to come into play, because it may be slightly more complex, right? So if we think about sort of integrating your charging behavior with now kind of your traveling patterns, right? You might have some kind of commutes that look like this, right? You might be going to work, maybe you go out to eat, go back to work, go home. Maybe you go to the gym on one day, maybe you're going to the movie theater on the weekend, you go grocery shopping, right? And now you have this very sort of different suite of opportunities to refuel, right? Because whereas the gas car only fills up at the gas station, I could be charging at home, at work, maybe certain restaurants at the parking lot, they have some chargers. Maybe at the movie theater, there's a charger, maybe at the grocery store, right? And so now there's a lot more opportunity to charge, and the sort of world of refueling starts to look really different from what a gas car refueling looks like. And this is going to have some pretty important implications, right? We're going to talk about the relationship between electric vehicles and the grid, right? And you can imagine maybe the time of day that I want to charge my car makes a big difference if I'm charging during the day when there's a lot of solar power, for example, right? And so again, all of this is getting way more complex. And before we get to those issues about like grid integration and that sort of thing, we first want to have a good idea of what the charging patterns actually look like, to think about, oh, if I want to manipulate how people charge, for example, to what extent can I do that? So last time we talked about travel behavior, and that is going to be sort of an important, it plays an important role in relationship with charging behavior, right? So if you remember in last class, this chart shows the times of day that people are driving. And if you look at, for example, this is a distribution of charging times at home, right? This is almost a complete inverse of your travel behavior, which makes sense, right? You're not going to be charging when you are driving your car, and you're not going to be charging at home when your car is sort of out during the day. And so the times that people drive and the times that people charge are often inversely correlated. And then drivers, again, can't charge when their vehicles are actually being used. But the majority of the time, right, for anyone here who owns a car or knows someone who owns a car, right, you can imagine the vast majority of the time the car is kind of just sitting around, parked somewhere. And all of that time that the car is sitting there is an opportunity for the vehicle to be charging. Okay, so I think one of the things I want to motivate about why we consider this kind of an important issue, similar to what I was talking about before with travel behavior, there's a whole bunch of complexity with electric cars, but then in a lot of modeling studies, people make a lot of simplifying assumptions. So remember, we talked about NHTS last time. You can determine where the vehicles are going, how far they're going, when they're going. But not a lot of those vehicles are actually electric cars. And so when thinking about charging behavior, a lot of energy modelers, for example, will do this kind of assumption. So basically they say, okay, I'm going to figure out from the NHTS what time people arrive at home. I'm going to figure out how much they travel in a given day. And then I'm going to basically charge the vehicle based off of your sort of daily travel patterns, right? And so that's this kind of simple assumption where you drive, you go home and you charge, you drive, you go home and you charge. And when we look at the actual data on how people behave, for example, almost no one charges every day. It's like extremely rare where we see something like that in the empirical data. And so we want to kind of break down these assumptions to see, how big of an effect doing something like this versus using real data is going to have when you're thinking about issues related to energy consumption, issues related to, grid integration. Okay. Questions about this so far? So the best way to examine this, I think, is to kind of just dive into the data. I've talked about some of the sources that we look at here at Davis, but we'll also be drawing on some other studies as well that look at empirical charging data. So as I mentioned, how often do drivers charge? So let me kind of break down this diagram here. Basically, this is categories of like short range and long range electric vehicles, and then short range and long range plug-in hybrids. And then across these columns here, this is level 1, level 2, and DC fast charging. And then this is the sort of probability of charging today. It's based off of these travel surveys asking electric vehicle owners over the course of a week what days that they charged in like the last week. So as I mentioned, if everyone charged every single day, then you'd see a big bar over here, essentially. But clearly, that's not happening. And so what you can see is that it's much more common for the sort of shorter range vehicles to be charging more often for full battery electric. Okay, and you can see that for longer range ones, they tend to prefer higher level charging. And so if you're doing a long range electric vehicle, full battery electric vehicle, right? Look at the level 2 plot compared to the level 1. Way more L2 charging. So there's preferences in terms of power there as well. And you can see the relative sort of breakdown of like how often DC fast charging is compared to level 2 charging. Much lower, right? So this on the sort of left-hand side, right? Lower probability of these things happening. Here, for plug-in hybrids, these are both at 0 because plug-in hybrids don't actually have the ability to do DC fast charging, or there aren't any models except for the Pacifica, the minivan. And so again, you can see kind of the differences in how often these guys are charging here. Okay, so that last question on the poll, refers to essentially this, and what we're seeing here is that the frequency of charging depends both on the type of electric vehicle and the range of the electric vehicle, and then also on the power rate of the charging. But importantly, compared to a lot of these studies that are assuming everyone charges up every day, we don't see that happening sort of ever. Yeah. So this is a survey of about 40,000 electric vehicle drivers in California. Yeah. Yeah, that's referring to kind of a category of range. Basically, the way you should think about it is like, this is a short range. Yeah, 100 miles. We consider like up to about 120 miles as like short range. And then for plug-in hybrids, we consider kind of up to like 25-ish miles as short range plug-in hybrids. And then anything above that is a long range. There aren't actually that many long range plug-in hybrids, especially anymore. The two most popular long range ones were the Honda Clarity and the Chevy Volt, both of which were discontinued. So not that many vehicles in this category anymore. Okay. Yeah, and I think I mentioned this last time. There's some category of people who just don't charge their cars at all for plug-in hybrids, especially with the Toyota Prius plug-in hybrids. We can see here this is the share of electric miles that we would expect them to have based off of those calculations, right, about utility factors that we were talking about last time. But you can see that those numbers are way lower for Toyota Priuses than kind of expected. And that's because of some of these issues I was talking about in the travel behavior side of things, where, you know, if you are commuting longer than the distance of your electric range, a lot of times people just won't even bother charging. They don't like having to deal with the fact that the engine is turning on and it's kind of inevitable that that's happening. And so, yeah, we definitely observe and have talked to a number of drivers who just don't charge their cars at all. Yeah, so even with the same daily commutes, there's a big discrepancy between their EVMT. Okay, and how much do people drive, or how much do people charge in a single session? So this plot is from a conglomerated set of public charging providers. So this is for DC fast charging. And a lot of studies assume that, okay, anytime I go to charge, I'm always going to sort of fill up the charger to full, right? This is in line with this like idea of like how we fill up at a gas station, right? And it's pretty rare that someone would like go to the gas station and only fill up half their tank. But we find that this type of thing happens now pretty often. So, you know, for example, if I go sort of grocery shopping and there happens to be a charger there, you know, I'll plug and charge the car while I'm there, but I'm not going to purposely grocery shop for like 2 or 3 hours just to charge up my car, right? And so we observe this in the data as well. So often these are associated with time constraints with people charging their vehicle. That time constraint is often kind of removed if you're home charging. So you do see sometimes people, you know, it's more often that you'll see people charging their vehicle all the way up at home. But again, dependent on the size of the battery as well. There are some instances where it can be tough to completely fill up the battery at home if you only have like a level 1 charger, for example. Yeah, so this is this distribution of like kilowatt hours per charge. And there's this kind of distribution here that looks like this. It's a, you know, fairly sort of normal distribution. Except there's this kind of spike here. Can anyone guess why that happens? So this actually has to do, this is a pretty interesting artifact. We like saw this in the data and we were like, what the hell is this? We have no idea why it looks like this. So it turns out, and this is maybe a little bit earlier days. So this is like 2016, 2017. So if you buy a Nissan Leaf, a new Nissan Leaf at the dealership, Nissan will give you a is it 1 year or 2 year? I can't remember. It's either a 1 year or 2 year free membership to EVgo. And you are allowed to go to any EVgo charger and plug in and charge for free for 30 minutes. Okay. And so this cutoff here is a bunch of people charging for exactly 30 minutes at a DC fast charger, which is going to get you about 20 kilowatt hours. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I had a question. Similar to that, like, I know a lot of dealers like Tesla, you can buy memberships.
Yep.
I think we already talked about that. Is that possibly why that's like that too? Or you think it's just like the new ownership deals?
So this one specifically, we kind of went into the data and we figured out that these were all Nissan Leafs that all had a specific membership type. So this is basically all free EVgo members that got limited to 30 minutes of charging. That's the spike here, right? Everyone else here is kind of like normal. But yeah, you can see that the price of charging, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, can kind of shift behavior and distort. I guess if you're thinking about this from a sort of pure sort of like economics approach, right? This kind of distorts the way the market is operating when you have free charging, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, but some economists might disagree. Okay. So we can see, right, pricing can affect it. The type of vehicle that you're driving can affect it, can affect your charging behavior. The speed of charging affects it. Okay, let's look in a little bit more detail about how types of vehicles. So don't worry about the XFC. That's a sort of separate thing. So again, short range, long range electric vehicles, short range, long range plug-in hybrids. And alongside the slide that I showed earlier, a lot of the research has shown that charging behavior depends pretty heavily on the battery size and range and the technology type. Okay. And so that actually means that a lot of this research gets outdated very quickly. And because the change in the composition of available electric vehicles is happening very rapidly. And so now, where you used to have, let's say, kind of like an even split between these guys, now it's all 75% of the market is Teslas. So you're mainly talking about vehicles that look like this. And so when you're thinking about the implications of charging behavior, where you might evenly split this several years ago, now you might like concentrate more on this guy here. And so yeah, this has pretty important implications, again, to do calculations for like energy consumption and timing of charging and that sort of thing. Okay. So where do drivers charge their cars? This is a kind of nice study that gives us an overview of locations of charging. So most of you guys got this right in the polls. The majority of charging happens at home. And we've talked about this a little bit. And actually you can see kind of a difference in breakdown by vehicle type as well. So like Nissan Leafs charge the least at home compared to, let's say, a Tesla, which has slightly larger blue bar here. So this is broken down into actually finer categories. So we have home only we have work only and public only. So these are generally the three categories of locations we think about for charging infrastructure. But then there are people who charge both at home and at work, people who charge both at home and at public chargers, people who charge just at work and in public, and then people who use all three. So it's a little bit trickier to distinguish like the amount of charging that actually happens at home, right? Because it's like this plus part of the yellow, plus part of the dark blue, plus part of the super dark blue. But generally, we do know that the majority happens in home locations. Again, this type of this breakdown that we see here is definitely sort of dynamic and will be changing over time, right? We think about the earliest phase of EV buyers. These are going to be generally wealthier populations, right, who own homes in which they can charge their vehicles. And as electric vehicles filter down to kind of the rest of the population, hopefully, you might see larger segments of the population who might not have home charging access, right? And so that's going to start shifting these pies as well. And then we've got a bunch of vehicles coming out, as I mentioned. And so do those vehicles look more like this type of car? Or does it look more like a Volt? Or does it look more like a Tesla, right? So I think vehicles that have similar characteristics, so if we're just sort of generically saying like a short range BEV and a long range BEV, I would hypothesize that the sort of charging behaviors of those vehicles within that sort of class will kind of look similar, but the proportions of each of those classes may be shifting the overall breakdown of charging behavior. Yeah. So this one ran annually from 2014 through now. And I think this particular study was done through 2018, I think. So this one probably just misses the entry of the Model 3. Yeah.
In the next decade or two, the splits.
Yeah, I think so. I think that both the composition of the vehicles is going to shift the pie, and the population of people who have electric vehicles, like the way they interact with home versus work versus public, is also going to be different. Yeah, and I would certainly think that that as you propagate to sort of broader segments of the population, that maybe the home only is going to start decreasing a little bit, but that's kind of my own theory. I wouldn't say that's necessarily backed by any direct evidence. Okay, so where you live and how you charge. And so this partly informs some of my thinking, right? So if I live in a single family detached home, right, that's your sort of typical home that you might think of, versus if I live in a condo, versus if I live in an apartment, you can see the breakdown of where I decide to charge is pretty different, right? So let's take a look here. If I'm living in a single detached home, then 37% of the time, I'm only going to be charging at home. Whereas only a third of that, right, less than a third of that, 12% of the time, you're charging at home as an apartment, someone who lives in an apartment, right? And so in that case, a lot of that is made up by charging at work, 45%, which is a little bit less than double someone who'd be living at home. And we see these kind of similar trends, right? So if you live in a condo, slightly lower percent at home and much higher sort of at work. Yeah, and I think this makes sense, right? You're 3 times more likely to charge at home compared to if you live in an apartment. That's basically coming down to whether or not you even have access to charging at an apartment. Pretty similar trends for plug-in hybrid owners as well. Although for some reason, it seems that in PHEV owners tend to have much larger sort of multi-location charging. And I think that actually has to do with the fact that PHEVs tend to charge more frequently. And so they will take sort of more opportunity to charge when possible. So let's say I'm driving a Honda Clarity, 50-mile range. I'm using up that 50 miles all the time. And so as soon as I go to a grocery store and I see opportunity to charge, I'll do it. Whereas if I'm driving like a long range electric vehicle, maybe the charger is a little bit farther away from the store. I don't want to bother walking. I have plenty of range, so I'm not going to bother charging there. So that's part of the reason why plug-in hybrids, I think it has to do more with the range than specifically the technology that they're charging in more locations. Okay, this was a slide that I had shown earlier. So how many homes can support charging? And so this is kind of speaking to this issue that certain populations, right, aren't going to have access to home charging. So this was work done by the California Energy Commission, basically looking at potential access and whether or not certain interventions can help to improve accessibility to charging and what that would kind of look like, right? And so this is basically what we're talking about as a default. Single family home, multifamily home, and all. So you're talking about maybe a quarter of the total population in California who's going to have access to home charging. And potentially that could get higher if you do things like modifications to do installations, or if you have sort of parking behavior modifications, you might be able to support more home charging. And one of the things that I want to clarify here is that there is a sort of new thought behind this term home charging. It's not necessarily even just like a charger in your own garage. This could mean like having some kind of dedicated charging that could be on street as well. So this is something that's happening in like Los Angeles. I don't know if anyone's seen these, but they have on the street light poles, they have chargers that you can access. So if you're parking on street, you don't even need to be. This isn't necessarily like an apartment parking lot. We now think of home charging as basically the ability to have regular access to charging overnight, and it doesn't just have to be in like your own garage. Yeah.
It seems to me that the number is really low. So that reflects it like not that many people follow charger. That makes a lot of sense. Seems very low.
No, okay. Yeah, actually, this probably has, no, this probably has a weird denominator. I don't know exactly how they're calculating the proportion. There are papers that look at sort of the percentage of single family homes that that have access either as something that you can install or that are sort of immediately available. And if I remember from those papers, it's usually like 60, 70%. It's not 100%. It's like 60, 70%. Yeah, so this one does seem a little bit lower than I'm thinking, but I'll look into the details of this and report back. Yes.
When you say home charging, are we talking level 2 charge? You say like install a charger. Level 1 charge,
Yeah, yeah. No, I believe this can be level 1 or level 2. They might have slightly different metrics for measuring access. So like if it's a certain distance away from like where you regularly park your car, they might consider that you don't have access. So that might be it, but I'll look into it a little bit more. Okay, so for public charging, specifically for DC fast charging, yeah, there was a lot of work in this area thinking about what's known as corridor charging versus what you might consider sort of local charging. So DC fast chargers, these charge way faster than level 1, level 2. And the idea, right, is, okay, we're going to use these things to essentially support like long distance trips, right? So if you want to drive from, what is this, Sac to Bakersfield, right? We want to develop some kind of network along, either the Highway 5 corridor or the Highway 99 corridor to basically allow these type of trips to happen with electric vehicles. Okay, and so there's that type of thing, and then you also have sort of localized DC fast charging. So you're thinking about placing these in urban areas rather than sort of in rather than sort of along the corridor. So what do you guys think gets more utilized, the corridor charging or the local charging? Local, yeah, okay. So there was, again, we can kind of look at this retrospectively and kind of figure this out. But at the time, right, there was a lot of thinking that, the slower and residential charging can support all the sort of local stuff. And then the DC fast charging, we can mainly have it as corridor. And kind of what we observe in the data is that sort of the vast majority of public charging events happen within sort of 5 to 10 miles of home. So not really sort of utilization does happen at sort of longer distances, these like 100-mile plus, but most of it is happening at home. Okay, yeah, I should maybe break down how to read this. So, okay, this is for the Nissan Leaf, and this is for a Chevy Bolt. And basically, the x-axis here is the distance to the charger that they're using. And then this kind of tells you how the proportion of the of all those chargings, how far that's happening from home. Okay, and so you can see in both cases, right, the biggest bar is within 5 miles of home. So again, this doesn't mean that we can just ignore corridor charging, right? This is giving us perspective about how chargers are getting used and giving a better sense of like, if I'm deploying chargers strategically, how should I think about doing that? Yeah. Yeah, they actually both have a bump. It's just a binning thing. So if you make a histogram, you like cut it off and it says everything above 100 we'll just put in that last bin. So it just means that there's like a really kind of long tail here that all gets like tossed into this one bucket. And nowadays, again, not to say that like corridor charging doesn't happen, but we think about the deployment of these chargers strategically in a way that you want them, you want the chargers to be getting used, right? To an extent, that's how a lot of these guys are going to be making money, and so you wouldn't necessarily want to just focus deployments in corridors. And in fact, that's kind of what we're seeing now, is that a lot of the vast majority of like DC fast chargers are mainly getting deployed in sort of urban areas to provide support for local charging and seeing these kind of charging patterns. And a lot of sort of government is providing support to, you know, build these out on freeways and corridors. Okay, how fast do drivers charge? So here we look at a breakdown between full battery electric vehicles on weekdays versus weekends, and then plug-in hybrids on weekdays versus weekends. Again, this is coming from empirical data. And so let's see, we've got home only, work only, public only, and then the combinations. This is from that same sort of paper. And we can observe, okay, actually pretty big differences between weekday and weekend. And that probably makes a lot of sense, right? If we're including workplace charging, you're going to see a lot less of that happening on the weekend. And the breakdown of the colors is down here. So you have blue for home, sort of brown for work, and then green for public, and then DC fast charging as this sort of darker brown. And you can see kind of how the patterns change between both types of vehicles and then sort of types of days. Okay, so we've covered all, like a very sort of wide variety and span of different factors that go into affecting the way people charge, right? And that has gone into sort of more sophisticated like systems models to try and get a sense of what aggregate loads look like. So what I mean by that is all of these figures and charts that I'm showing you are basically examining patterns of like individual drivers. But when we think about the net impact of all these people charging in different times, at different speeds, in different locations, that's going to play a role in a lot of the sort of energy sector modeling. So I want to show kind of one example of this. This is probably one of the most well-known. It's actually meant for infrastructure deployments, but they do things like providing insight into the aggregate charging behavior of these vehicles. So it's called EVI Pro. What does it stand for? Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Projection Tool. And so this was developed by the National Energy Renewable Laboratory, which is one of the national labs under the Department of Energy. And so the most recent version, EVI Pro 2, was done in collaboration with us and with the California Energy Commission. And so they do things like analyze the daily travel patterns of light duty vehicles, right, using an HTS data set. And they try to look at all of these things that we literally just talked about, all the factors about different technologies and locations and behavior and how that relates to the way people end up charging. So actually, why don't we try this? Let me see if I can open this up. Okay, So they actually have kind of a light version of this tool online for people who want to play around with it. And so this can actually be a pretty useful tool for like local stakeholders who are thinking of, who might be wanting to deploy infrastructure and thinking about, oh, how much will I need? So let me jump over here. So if I want to look at a particular city or urban area, I can click here. So we'll jump over to California. Choose a major urban area. Okay. Let's see. Okay, why don't we do Sacramento? It's pretty close by. So they have this nice little reference thing here. In Sacramento, there's about 1.7 million light duty vehicles at the end of 2016, and about 8,000 of those were electric cars. And so now they ask, okay, how many electric cars do we want to support? So let's say, okay, let's say 100,000. And I just hit calculate. And you get a whole bunch of kind of interesting results. Right here, they say, okay, we're probably going to need to support 100,000 electric cars in this particular area. You'll probably need around 2,000 workplace L2 chargers, about 1,000 public L2 chargers, and maybe 130 DC fast chargers. And you can even play around with the mix here, right? So short range plug-in hybrids, long range plug-in hybrids. So let's say, let me change this because I think maybe Tesla is going to dominate everybody, right? Maybe I'll say 85%. And we'll change this to 5% here, get back to 100%, recalculate. And you can see that the number of chargers is going to change quite a bit, right? And so this is kind of a handy tool that helps break all of these things down. And the other thing that they do is you can look at load profiles. Okay, so let me do this. We'll do the same place. Okay, and here, now we see this sort of aggregate load profile. And that represents the electricity demand coming from all of the cars being charged in this network. And so this is essentially what the grid, your electricity grid would see as a demand. And you can see the components of this, right? You have home charging sort of in the bottom two, and then during the daytime, you would have some work charging, some public L2, and then some DC fast charging as well. And then that shape might look pretty different on the weekend. Okay, so let me jump back to the slides here. Yeah, so this is essentially kind of the same thing, looking at a sort of statewide load profile example in 2030. So lots of variability in charging patterns. So when we were thinking about all of the plots that I was showing before, there's a lot of stochasticity in individual drivers charging at any given time. But in aggregate, the patterns start to become much more regular and measurable like this. In this particular example, this is showing a weekday load profile of a projection in 2030. And we can see actually the scale of this is about 4,000 megawatts or about 4 gigawatts. So for reference, what that looks like in California, peak load, the average peak load in California is about 30 gigawatts. So you're talking, what that essentially means that on any given day, electric vehicles would be constituting more than 10% of all the electricity demand in California in just a decade. All right, any questions about this? Let's take a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll get back to this. Okay, so let's break away from some of the empirical data stuff, talk about some qualitative issues with charging behavior. One that's becoming more and more common, so charger congestion. So as EVs get increasingly popular, so will crowds at charging stations. I don't know if you guys ever go to the Safeway with the Tesla charger. If you go there in the evenings, like you can see, it's almost always packed full. And yeah, I think we'll start to see that sort of more and more. A lot of the places that I go to regularly charge used to be sort of totally available a couple years ago, and now it's a struggle to find sort of any charging. One of the things that actually helps with this, it's kind of silly, but actually can make a pretty big difference, is this idea of charger etiquette. So there are lots of like guides on this, but generally like this idea of, okay, if charging spaces are meant for charging, and so don't park there just because you're an electric vehicle unless you're actually charging. Monitor your charge while you're away from your vehicle. This is a big one. Like if people sit at the charger all day and they're already full, you'd be blocking someone else from charging. And a lot of times, sometimes you might be charging for convenience rather than necessity, and that can be a tricky thing to kind of see explicitly, right? If someone's just charging their car, I don't know if they're just topping off or if they're filling up because they need that charge. And so a lot of times you can get these sort of pamphlet things that you can put on the sort of dash of your car, where you say, okay, like it's okay to unplug me, I'm just like convenience charging, or please don't unplug me. And then oh yeah, go ahead. No, it's literally a piece of paper and you like fold it, and then one half you can show. Yeah. No, not necessarily, right? Because yeah, this is the nice thing about a charger, is that a plug can serve like multiple spaces, right? So if you park next to someone, like the cord is usually long enough to reach. It could actually, usually the cords are long enough to reach like maybe 2 spaces. And then you could be, if you're thinking about, okay, like if these desks are arranged as parking spots, right? You can come in like this. If the charger's here, you could actually come in on the other side too. So, a single plug could be serving as many as like 4 spots. So you wouldn't necessarily need to move their car. Although if there's like a charger there that has 4 plugs and it's serving all 4, and then one of them's done charging but doesn't leave, then you would have to do something like moving their car. It's tricky too. There's a feature in most electric cars now have this. There's a feature where when you plug when you put the plug into the port, there's a little locking mechanism, and that's built in so that, you remember when I brought in the cords in from class, those ones, someone could just steal them, right? And they're expensive. They could cost like a couple $100. And so that locking mechanism prevents people from stealing a cable. But it also makes it so that you can't unplug someone if if they need to. And so you can unlock it. And generally that's the kind of practice that you would do if you had this kind of green card here. Okay, slightly related concept, but okay. So let's say you are an owner of an electric vehicle and you want to go charge, so you go to a location. Would you prefer that that spot is full of other cars, or would you want to just be able to access it on, like, it's empty and no one else is charging and you can use it anytime you want? Yeah, just for you, just for you.
Most likely have one with personal space, but it really depends if there's like food nearby, because you probably want to eat while you're.
Yeah, well, okay. I'm just talking about accessibility, right? Like, do you prefer to see lots of cars charging or few cars charging? Exactly. So the less cars are there, then the less competition I have to try and get a plug, right? Okay, so let's say you are a business who owns the charging network, okay? And you want to make money, you want to sell electricity. So do you want to see lots of electric cars charging or very few? Lots, right? Okay, so that's like a direct sort of conflict, right? So there's this idea thinking about utilization versus reliability. And these concepts were talked about kind of separately for a long time, but people are realizing that there is this intrinsic conflict between these two, because as a customer, I want this, right? I want no one else to be charging. So when I go there, I got a spot open, don't have to deal with unplugging other people's cars and leaving notes and all that sort of thing, right? But as a business, I want this. I want to be selling my chargers. I want them to be utilized as close to 100% as possible. Yeah, and so, okay, the utilization numbers, just as a reference, right? You're never going to get up to 100%. Usually the ones that we talk about, chargers that are like extremely congested, and see, we call these kind of like super stations because there's a constant use of them. These usually peak out at about 30% utilization. And what I mean by that is, like, at any given time, 30% of the time it'll be used. And that's because like public chargers, even if you have really high utilization, you're not really going to see people charging there at midnight, 3 a.m., whatever, right? And so 30% is very high. But most public chargers are going to range between like 1 to say 10, 15%. And then in terms of reliability, this is this idea that if I'm not convenience charging, if I am necessity charging, I want to be able to rely on a certain charger. And so those chargers, the chargers that I want to rely on need to actually have low utilization. So one of the interesting things that we were finding in our studies is that if you talk to someone and they say, okay, I want stations that are reliable, those stations are exactly the opposite of the high utilization stations. They will avoid places that a lot of people go to charge because they can't count on having access to a charger. Okay, so let's talk about sort of slightly different concept. So we now have some kind of understanding of the sort of patterns of charging and the factors that go into it. And we have some understanding of some of the motivations for people wanting sort of high reliability stations versus businesses that might want high utilization. And then what other uses there might be for altering charging, right? This might relate to thinking about grid integration issues. And so how do we get people to actually change their charging behavior? So one of the things that we already talked about, right, was that one sort of spike in that distribution. So free charging can cause a big shift in charging behavior. Makes sense, right? And so here we can see sort of a breakdown between people charging. So when charging at work is free, more people charge at work, big surprise, right? But we can actually quantify the extent to which this actually happens. So if I go from blue to purple versus striped red to striped purple, we can see how these differences are sort of panning out as you go from paid to free and paid to free for full battery electric and paid to free for plug-in hybrids. So battery electrics are in solid, plug-in hybrids are striped. And so if I have free charging at work, I go from half of the charging that I do at home to only 20%. And that rest is made up here in work, right? If charging at work is not free, only 15% of the time do I charge at work. But if it is free, that goes up to almost half of the time I'm charging at work. And that's sort of consistent across the different technology types as well. And this type of data can help you get estimates of like elasticity. So if you're an economist, right, you care about kind of behavioral response to price changes, and data like this can help sort of understand that. And we can take those elasticities to think about, okay, if I have some kind of rates, how might that change charging behavior? So I think we've talked about this a little bit. I'll go through this really quickly. So this is how it used to be. We used to have these flat tiered rates in PG&E that no longer exists. You are now sort of by default registered into time of use rates, which looks like this. So basically, depending if it's in the summer or in the winter and sort of what tier that you're in, you could be paying sort of different amounts of money for electricity at different times of the day. So up to 4 p.m. and then from 4 to 9 you pay more, and then after 9 you pay less. And there are different plans that you can enroll in. But generally, the times are going to be bundled into 2 or 3 categories of on-peak versus off-peak. We'll actually talk a little bit about why this happens when we do our electricity grid lecture. The prices are generally kind of structured to correspond to the cost of producing the electricity. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there is some baseline of electricity that you get to use, and then everything past that, it costs you a little bit more money. So that baseline is going to vary on a number of conditions, but let's say, 100 units of electricity. If you use up to that, you're paying a certain amount, and then once you hit that, so yeah, you pay this 26 cents base, and then above that, you start paying 33 cents. So that's the difference between this dotted line here.
That's allocated per person basis.
Yeah, or per household. Yeah. You can actually get special rates if you own an electric vehicle from PG&E. So they have even more sort of tiers here. So instead of the traditional time of use rates, EV owners can opt into these special rates. These are a little bit different. You can see the peaks are like way higher, 56 cents compared to 42 cents or 38 cents, right? But the off peak here is 28 cents. whereas here it's 24 cents. And so the idea here is like an electric car has a much sort of higher load demand to the utility. And so they really want you to not charge on peak, and they're willing to give you a better rate off peak and a higher rate sort of on peak. Yeah. Yeah, so these rates used to be pretty popular, especially because like early buyers or enthusiasts were sort of into doing a lot of these calculations and that sort of thing. I think these days, just like not that many people know about this and bother signing up for these types of things. So I think the proportion of people who enroll in EV rates now is quite a bit lower than it used to be. As a direct answer to your question, I don't know the actual sort of percentages. Yeah, I would say not that high. A lot of times, just in general, the way these are structured can be worse off for you if you're using electricity in a certain way. So even though this is like a special offer for people who own electric vehicles, you might still not want to sign up for it, unless there is one big interesting caveat here that we did see happening. So notice when the peak is happening. So from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. So if you own rooftop solar, okay, the way this works is through something called net metering. If I own a solar panel on my house, okay, I usually have a meter that measures the amount of electricity that's coming into my house, and that's how much you pay to PG&E based off of that measurement of electricity. Net metering allows you to go in the other direction. If you're producing electricity from your solar panel and basically putting it back on the grid, you get to sell back to the grid at your retail rates. So if I have rooftop solar and an electric car and I enroll in this, and my sun is producing, and the sun is producing electricity for me at this time period, you actually make a boatload of money. Okay, you can pay off your solar panel, like usually you pay off your solar panel in sort of many years. And we saw some examples of people being able to do that like in like a year or two. Yeah.
So it's different prices. They're I'll start charging more to like 12 a.m. make it stop at 7 different prices.
Yep. That's a common feature on basically all electric cars. It's just like it's a little setting that basically says, you know, start charging at a specific time. You can control it on your phone as well. Yeah, and you plug in the car and it'll do it all for you. Yeah, we'll sort of, there are some more complex versions of this, basically where you can imagine that prices might be like a little bit more dynamic than this coming from the grid. This is like a potential kind of future for pricing. And there are businesses who are trying to like take advantage of this, thinking about like installing an app on your phone to be able to control this a lot more sort of dynamically. So that whole world of things actually gets pretty complicated and interesting. It's definitely a big sort of business opportunity. Yeah, and then public charging rates. Yeah, we've looked at things like this before. Again, In public, you might be paying sort of different rates as well, but then there, like even though these might be lower than the sort of actual electricity rates, there are other like fees associated, like a one-time connection fee or membership fees. Tesla has their own thing, right? And so the whole idea here is there's this whole world of different rate structures at home, in public, and possibly even in workplaces, although a lot of workplaces now are free charging. That'll probably start to change in the future. And so sort of thinking about ways in which we can manipulate the rates to change charging behavior is like a big topic these days, to think about aligning with certain types of outcomes, whether it be making sure that charging is available for customers at certain times of the day, or that you are getting people to charge when there's a lot of solar available, right? There's lots of different sort of outcomes that you could try and push people towards by changing the pricing in certain ways. It's actually probably a lot easier for public chargers to do this rather than trying to manipulate electricity prices for home charging, because all of these rates, from PG&E, SDG&E, SMUD, SCE, anytime that I want people to pay for electricity, that has to go through the Public Utilities Commission. That goes through a whole rigorous process of rate setting. And so manipulating these rates to do certain things is a lot harder than these network providers, Tesla, EVgo, Electrify America. They can kind of change the rates to whatever they want. And actually the reason why these guys are allowed to do that is because they're not selling the electricity technically. They're selling other types of services, right? So this is why Tesla is selling like by minute, by amount of time, rather than by some amount of electricity. And then these guys have other sort of session fees and like monthly fees, membership fees. It's almost more like they could argue that you're actually paying for the parking spot, right? And not actually for the electricity. That's how they get around the requirements from the PUC to set rates for electricity. Yeah. Yeah. So here they have different tiers of charging and you pay a different amount by time. And so 17 cents per minute, 45 cents per minute, 84 cents per minute, $1.35 per minute at different speeds. And those will correspond to actually different amounts by electricity prices. So technically the most efficient or the cheapest would be 60 kilowatts speed of charging. But I guess what you're paying for here at the higher speeds is basically having to spend less time at the charger. And so they're charging like a premium for that. It's a reasonable thing to do, right? It's okay, if I put my sort of economist hat on, like having people pay more is kind of ensuring access for faster resources for those who need it. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like unfair. Yeah, and so in this sort of similar study, besides just looking at free versus not free, we can actually observe that changing electricity rates actually does make a difference. And so folks are more likely to charge at home if you're enrolled in an EV rate. So you can charge strategically in such a way that you're kind of saving money. And we can see how that shift happens. So if you are on a flat or a time of use rate, the charging pattern changes, where I go from 30% people charging at home up to 46% of the time I'm going to be charging at home if I have an EV rate. And again, all of this is kind of building into this set of insight that we have about how people are responding to different rates for sort of fueling their car. What I will say though is that it's a pretty sort of interesting nuance of behavior, but in sort of a bigger picture, right? The electricity prices that all of these folks are paying is like way lower than gasoline, and you think about the variability in fuel prices for gasoline versus the kind of variability that people are capturing here, and there's a pretty big difference. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So you're saying, oh, are these extra 15 or 17% of people, are they actually strategically charging and taking advantage of? Yeah, actually, in a lot of the, yeah, that's an interesting question. In some of the earlier data that we were getting, we were seeing like a huge spike of people all of a sudden charging at midnight. And we were like, okay, like, why is that happening? Like it's not as though, so for PG&E, the time of rate time of use rate changes at 9 p.m. So we're kind of like, well, if people are doing it strategically, like they should be setting their timer to 9 p.m. and not at midnight. So why are we observing like this giant spike at midnight? And it turns out it's just because that's the default setting for a lot of people, for a lot of the vehicles. So like the Nissan Leaf and some of the Chevy Bolts and Bolts, if you say, oh, set it at a certain time to charge, it starts at midnight. And so people just use that default setting and they know that it's off peak then. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. We do think people are cognizant of the timing, but like even like there is unexpected behavior due to like these weird nuances that take some time for us to figure out. Okay. Some special cases of charging behavior. So kind of in the same vein that I did last time, I want to talk a little bit about some research specifically that I do in the realm of electric vehicles and TNC companies, so Uber and Lyft. So this is kind of the statistic that I was talking about in Monday's lecture, where we saw in a really short period of time in 2016, going through sort of 2018, this massive jump in electricity demand coming from electric vehicles on these services. Okay, so by 2018, we found that EVs in Uber and Lyft constituted only about 0.5% of EVs on the road, but were responsible for over 1/3 of all non-Tesla DC fast charging in California, right? That's like a crazy amount of, proportionally crazy amount of electricity. And they charge a lot, okay? So this is the plot I was showing before about DC fast charging for your sort of average driver in California. And they use, on average, they're charging up about 11 kilowatt hours of their battery versus on average double for TNCs. That's a lot in like an aggregate sort of distribution. We generally find, okay, on average, okay, how often are people charging at a DC fast charger? Okay, so you might be, if you own an electric car, you might be charging at home every couple days, filling up. How often would you be going out to a public DC fast charger? We find on average, maybe once every sort of 2 or 3 weeks is how often the average California driver charges at a DC fast charging station. Full-time drivers for Uber and Lyft use DC fast chargers on average 2 to 3 times a day. Okay, so the frequency with which they're using the infrastructure is way higher as well. Charging patterns also differ very substantially. This is a breakdown of DC fast charging use across 3 cities. So in Los Angeles, in San Diego, and San Francisco. So the charging patterns look a little bit different than sort of the residential, right? Because this is public DC fast chargers. And typically looks something like this. So very few sort of in the middle of the night, and then throughout the day, kind of building up, and in the afternoon, sort of larger peaks. It's a little bit different for Uber and Lyft drivers, right? They tend to want to provide services during commuting hours, right? And so, whereas this kind of ramps up earlier in the morning, we don't see as much of that happening until a little bit later. And then the peak of charging for your average driver actually tends to happen sort of in the post-evening commute hours, whereas that's where we see a very clear dip here. And that's because, right, as a Uber or Lyft driver, that's like dinner time. That's when you're probably providing a lot of rides. And so the shape of this charging looks pretty different. And you can see, whereas there's almost no sort of public charging in sort of the early morning, wee hours of the night, we actually see a fair bit of that happening still for Uber and Lyft drivers. And again, because we observe so much of this happening, this isn't like a sort of random problem, or I'm not going to say problem, but like this isn't just like a small thing for Uber and Lyft drivers. They're actually using, this represents actually a pretty substantial portion of public charging. Yeah, and that has a lot of sort of interesting implications too. When we talk about, one of the things that we think about with Uber and Lyft drivers is that they are by far the most price responsive drivers. And so because their sort of profit margins are sort of directly tied to operational costs. So thinking about like fuel, they will go much more out of their way, right? If you're thinking about the average Uber and Lyft driver, to get cheaper gas to drive more fuel efficient vehicles. And so before, when we talk about manipulating electricity prices or changing electricity prices to meet certain kind of outcomes, like you might be able to leverage that to these guys a lot more easily because they're going to be more responsive to things like price changes. Okay, the last sort of quote unquote special case of charging behavior, smart charging. So this will be kind of a bit of a preview for next class. And actually, that's a good sort of segue. So in the syllabus, Monday is supposed to be the guest lecture, but we're actually switching her to Wednesday. So I'm still going to do those lectures are just going to get swapped. So on Monday, we're going to talk about electric vehicles and the electricity grid, which is actually where I do most of my research. So this is kind of all more up my alley. So smart charging is this idea where we can have a form of charging that integrates information that's getting passed to the end user or the vehicle from the electricity grid. There's a whole bunch of sort of technical challenges associated with this. And I tend to think those are challenging, but can be sort of overcome. But then there's a whole set of like social and behavioral challenges associated with smart charging as well. And I think those are going to be fundamentally a lot harder to address. So we talked about this idea that like I can program my car to not start charging until 9 p.m. or until midnight, or maybe I'll have some kind of app that controls the charging a little bit more. But what if you were to hand control of the charging to, let's say, a third party? Okay, and you know, the whole idea here is that maybe they can leverage this smart charging idea, and they can actually maybe save you money, or in some cases, maybe they could even make you money. And so you enroll in this, and then the kind of nightmare scenario that a lot of people talk about is that like, oh, okay, your car is like relatively empty, you go, you plug it in, but someone else is controlling the charging, and then they decide, okay, we're not going to charge until like 1 a.m. or something, because maybe I can get the best prices then. But then you have an emergency and you need to go to the hospital and your car is out of fuel, right? That like totally kills the person's motivation to use this kind of scheme. And so that's why I tend to think that the sort of social and behavioral challenges associated with doing this kind of thing is going to be a lot harder than the technical challenges, which is, you know, still substantial, but like engineers, you know, are going to figure out how to do a lot of these sort of more technical things. But again, there's the challenges with the social side of things, I think, still remain to be solved. Okay, any questions about this? All right, so that's the end of the lecture for today. Just remember, homeworks are due at the end of the day today, so make sure to get that in. Otherwise, I'll see you guys all on Monday, and our guest lecture will be on Wednesday.